In this video, I want to talk about how to deal with conflict in a relationship and give you 3 tips for how to resolve conflict and manage it on a day-to-day basis. Hi, I'm Ron with Lead Skill, and we give tips and tools to help people communicate better and exercise leadership in all areas of their life. So when it comes to conflict in relationships, I can guarantee you in any relationship between 2 people, if you stay together long enough, you will eventually have conflict. Sometimes it comes up a lot faster than other times. I know for myself and my wife, we dated for about 3 years before we got married. And even while we were dating, we had times or moments of conflict. And so other relationships, I'm aware, they have a honeymoon stage where everything's great and the conflict only comes later. So each relationship is a little bit different, but you will eventually run into conflict. And so when those times come, I want to give you 3 tips that will help you to deal with conflict in a more effective way. So let me share a little bit on a personal level before I go into the 3 tips for how to deal with conflict. My wife and I have been married for 27 years now, and we dated for, I guess, about 3 years before that. So we've been together for 3 decades. From an early time in our relationship, we had a lot in common. We got along really well, but we also found areas of conflict. If I recall right, some of the things that were giving us the most problems early on was my lack of time management, and my wife felt disrespected. Even as my girlfriend, she stuck with me, and so here we are. And I think that's a testimony to her and her patience. I wanted to just share with you, because even before we got married, we went to some counseling with a couple that eventually were at our wedding. And they gave us some really good advice in about 3 or 4 sessions, I think. But they went through a model about how to communicate, how to deal with conflict. And it was very useful for us. I can still remember some of the lessons learned to this day. And as I was discussing this with my wife, she said, maybe some of those actually saved our marriage a number of times. So I've learned some things over the years, and I'd like to share them with you from some of the experience. And I'd call it hard lessons learned and gained. One of those that I will share with you that seems so basic, but is absolutely fundamental: breathe. Take a moment to breathe. It sounds really simple, but it's so crucial. Whenever you're in conflict, there's 3 predictable responses that you will have to it. You will either get aggressive and fight, you will retreat, which is flight, or you'll just freeze and just stand in place, become very stiff and still, or even kind of paralyzed. And for me, especially early on in my 20s, whenever my wife and I got into a conflict, my typical response was to freeze. I would just become unresponsive. I would stand there like I'm listening, but honestly, I was kind of paralyzed and I would just shut down. I learned more about this approach, not so much from my wife, just getting crazy and trying to get some sort of response from me. But what really helped me was I was learning and starting to practice a martial art called Aikido. Aikido is a way to deal with conflict, to de-escalate physical conflict. One of the things I learned when I was practicing in the dojo with Aikido was that whenever people would grab me or strike or come at me in an aggressive way, I would often also freeze. I would become stiff, and I was told early on, Ron, you got to loosen up. You're just too stiff. I learned that one of the best ways to loosen up is to breathe, is to take a deep breath. And I think a lot of us in relationship need to take a moment whenever we're in conflict, just to take that temporary time out and breathe. There's so much physical benefit involved. I mean, it just floods our brain with oxygen. It puts us in a better mental state. It eases our physical distress, whether you're stiff or whether you've got lots of muscle tension because you're fighting, or whether you feel like you're shrinking back because you're wanting to get away from the situation. You got to breathe. I've noticed sometimes that whenever I take a moment to breathe, it also slows down the pace of the conflict. And when I start breathing, I notice my wife starts breathing, and it just helps both of us calm down and find a more settled place. It de-escalates the conflict. And so just by breathing, it's been shown through studies that whenever two people are having a conversation, they often will mimic or mirror each other on an unconscious level. So one way you can take leadership in a relationship is to use this in a conscious way. Take a deep breath. Slow things down. Your partner will often respond even on an unaware or unconscious level. So try this. Practice it next time. Just breathe and slow things down. The second thing that you can do when you're in conflict is to strive to be objective. Try to take the third person perspective. Now, this is something that you can learn when you're working with a therapist or you go to a counselor, because you literally have a third person in the room who can help you be objective and ask questions, and they're not part of the conflict that's going on in a relationship or between a couple. What do you do though when you don't have a therapist around or you don't have a counselor? How do you take this third person perspective? Well, the truth is that in most conflicts, it feels very personal. It feels like everything is amplified. And so what is your predictable response to conflict? I know for me, one of the things I've learned over time is that my predictable response is anger. I'm angry. Now, that anger doesn't look like rage on the surface. In fact, it's a little more nuanced than that. On the emotions wheel, especially this one, learning emotions, in the anger sphere, there's a couple of different ways or expressions of anger. One of those is to be frustrated. Another one is to be critical. And actually, both of those are typical of the anger that I experience in conflict. One is I'm frustrated because things aren't going the way I want them to go. And second of all, I'm often critical of my wife, my partner in the relationship. And so I can be just sitting there quiet, but judging and being very critical. Now, over time, I've learned that anger is my typical response, and I'm moving through that and actually owning it and starting to be more authentic about the fact that I am angry. But for many years, I couldn't admit that. I just couldn't go there. I notice for other people, anger may not be the typical response. Maybe it's fear. Some people are really afraid of conflict. They think that the relationship can't survive, or maybe the family that they grew up in, it just wasn't something that was okay to express. And so there's a real fear of how to deal with conflict. Other people get sad, or they just have a kind of an unhappiness about what's going on, that they feel like the relationship isn't on a good footing. And so they have this response of, I'm just unhappy, I'm sad about this. If you don't check that, it can actually make you depressed. It can make you feel like long-term depression. I'm not talking about clinical depression, I'm talking about an emotional response to conflict. So we all have different conflict styles. The second tip that I gave, though, is about objective. Be objective. Take a third-person perspective. If you could imagine yourself watching it from the side, seeing yourself in this conversation, this heated conversation, this conflict with your partner, and also seeing your partner and seeing how they're responding. What's going on with them? Do they have a lot of tension? Are they kind of shrinking back? What is their emotional response? To be objective and to what I call depersonalize. Don't take everything so personal. It can be really useful in conflict to be able to step back and take that third person perspective. The third tip that I would share with you when you're in a conflict situation is to look for what you share as a common commitment. It's really interesting to me that when we are fighting, it's often over little stuff. It's little things, at least on the surface. If you want to trace things back, you often find that the little things are just stand-ins for bigger issues. So some of those bigger issues, a lot of couples fight over money, they fight over sex, or they'll fight over power. What I'm talking about is you may be fighting over money or finances, even though the expression on the surface is over a purchase of this, or, oh, I didn't tell you about that. And it's really about different approaches to how we handle and manage money. Another thing that is kind of a big issue, but we don't often talk about it, is power. Every relationship has power dynamics involved. And whether we feel respected and how we're using our power and our influence in the relationship and outside of the relationship with other people, in our circle, our network, those are big deals. That's a big deal for us. Those are big issues that we often don't talk about like that, but instead we pick at each other for the little things. There's also intimacy issues about whether it's affection, intimacy, sex, whether our parenting styles and how we are approaching the parenting task if you have children in this relationship. All of these are the bigger things that you often will fight over, but it's going to manifest in little things. So what do we do with all of this? Every time that I've had a conflict with my wife over some of these little things, the key to finding our way back to having peace and reconciliation is coming back to our common commitment. What is it that we're both going for in this relationship? Try to keep these tips in mind. Take a deep breath. Remind yourself to breathe when you're in a fight. Try to take a third-person perspective and be objective about the situation. Even study it, almost like a therapist or a counselor would, and look for the common commitment. What is the common ground that you share? If you go up a level or 2 levels, you will often find that, on a more basic level, we agree. On a more basic level, we share a common commitment. And if you can actually take that perspective with your partner, you're going to build empathy, and you're also going to find ways to actually work through these conflict situations in the day-to-day. I hope these tips have been helpful for you, and I really recommend that you would work with something like an emotions wheel using the 8 basic emotions and explore more about your conflict style and especially the emotional expression that you give to conflict and where you are in that process, and learn about your partner as well and where they are. It can really open up some interesting conversations. Maybe you're ready to move beyond the 8 and you can look at the 24 emotions and go a little bit deeper. For example, with my wife, we talked about this and she said, when she's actually feeling sad and I say, "Are you hurt?" It's not sad, it's really hurt. And when I learned to tune into that and say, "Dear, I think you're feeling hurt," she said in a moment it could shift her because she just really felt like I got her and she was heard, and I put language to what she was feeling. And then we could move beyond how she was responding, which was kind of like a hurt animal. And a hurt animal is going to lash out. And, it's going to create conflict. But when you can name an emotion and you can work through it together, it actually makes the relationship stronger and more resilient over time. And so maybe this is a tool that could help you. You can find links below and how to get a copy for yourself. I just hope that you will subscribe to our channel and you can learn more about how to use these tools more effectively in relationships to improve your communication and enjoy more fulfillment in what you're going for in life. Thanks for tuning in.